I'm David Tunick, representing the 50th reunion class of 1966. As you may know, one of our reunion gifts is the Class of 1966 Environmental Center next to the new library. So we're particularly excited to have these 5 extremely distinguished experts come to speak to a subject on point, not only to our gift, but of concern to all of us here today and to those who will follow us tomorrow. Indeed, we can say that the survival of our planet may be at issue. We are fortunate to have a Nobel Prize winner, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a United States Senator, an Undersecretary of State for the Environment, and an advisor to the President for the Environment up on stage to address our topic entitled Climate Change, Politics, Truth and Consequences. It is my distinct privilege to introduce the moderator, Bill Moomaw. Bill graduated from Williams in 1959 and returned after graduate school at MIT to teach chemistry. Some of us in the 50th class were his first Williams students. In 1967, President Jack Sawyer, as usual ahead of the curve, together with James McGregor Burns, asked Bill to offer the college's first environmental science course and an environmental studies program, the second by a few months of any college or university in the country. Bill was soon recruited to Washington as a consultant to the Senate and is the first director of the Science World Resources Institute, where he worked on ozone depletion and climate change. 4 years later, Tufts and their Fletcher School got him as the founding director of their Center for International Environment and Resource Policy. In 2007, Bill won the Nobel Peace Prize for his groundbreaking work on climate change. Now, supposedly in retirement, Bill continues to teach at Harvard, the Fletcher School, in the Netherlands, and other places abroad. And he carries on with research and participates in public policy on climate and related global issues. He and his wife, Margot, live in a zero-net energy home in Williamstown that produces sufficient solar electricity to meet all of its heating, lighting, and appliance requirements, but it does not erect fences that keep out deer. We were up there yesterday, and Bill had been doing that himself, which takes a lot of energy, his. So I give you and turn the program over to the highly decorated Professor William Moomaw.
Thank you very much, David. Just one slight correction. It was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that got the Nobel Prize. I just helped write it along with a couple 100 other people, but it was very nice to be recognized. First, let me just thank the class of 1966, which, as David said, was the first group of students I taught at Williams. I was barely older than they were when I arrived. My wife, Margot, was the youngest faculty wife. And there were still people on campus whom she knew when she was dating here before she knew me. So it was a bit of an awkward situation sometimes at various events. But anyway, I'm very grateful that Williams gave me the opportunity not only to do chemistry for 25 years, but also to take part in the development of the Environmental Studies Center and to be the director for 6 years in the 1980s, and to work with people like Tom Jorling, whom I see is here, who headed the center for many more years than that. Congratulations on your innovative thought, class of 66, that you would come up with something like building a building for environmental studies that would meet the most rigorous, demanding set of conditions imaginable. This building challenge that you've taken on is really quite remarkable. And I know that other classes have 66 envy over your innovative approach. It's great. It's great. Let me just try to set up, because not everybody is fully familiar either with climate change itself or this amazing process that culminated in December. The basic factors that determine the climate of the Earth, namely the relationship between incoming sunlight and the radiant heat from the warm Earth back into space, had been worked out by 1896. This is not new science. It was not until the mid-1980s that it was realized in the policy community that this might be having adverse consequences because we had added so much carbon dioxide and a bunch of other gases, methane and other things, to the atmosphere that were trapping the heat, preventing its going out into space, and the Earth was warming up. At the time, it wasn't a lot of what we know now was expected, it fit all the science, but it wasn't really verified. Since then, there's been great verification. The world is clearly warmer than it was before. It's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than in pre-industrial times. And that is evidenced by so many things. The oceans are warmer, sea level is higher, not only because it's expanded for the warmth, but also because glaciers have melted. They're receding all over the world. I've visited Patagonia, Argentina, Patagonia, Chile, Alaska, Europe, and it's every place I've been where there are glaciers, they're all in retreat. As I said to someone who questioned me about this, I said, it's probably not happening because of global cooling, right? It's happening because of global warming. And the changes are more profound. I mean, intense precipitation events. We just went through one of those. Turns out in the Northeast, these have increased by 71% since my senior year at Williams, right? Here in the Northeast United States. So these are things that are not happening to our great-grandchildren. These are things that are happening to us right now. And attempts to address climate change began in the 80s and culminated in a treaty, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed in Rio by something like 154 heads of state, including George Bush I, George Herbert Walker Bush. He brought it back to the United States, presented it to the Senate. That was in June, and by October it was ratified unanimously. It is difficult to imagine that happening today. The U.S. was the 5th nation to ratify and the first major nation. There were 4 small island nations who were afraid that literally they were going to go into the waves if things warmed up too much. They beat us. But we were the first industrial country. So there was an attempt to strengthen this through something called the Kyoto Protocol, and President Clinton signed it, and George Bush II unsigned it. There is no principle in international law for unsigning an agreement, but he did it anyway. So at that point, the Senate had made absolutely clear they would never ratify it, so the U.S. was on the outside of the rest of the negotiations for a period of 10 years or more. Realizing that things were getting worse, we began working, and there was a sort of a fiasco in 2009 in Copenhagen. But at that meeting, the pieces were put in place that actually ended up being negotiated and agreed to in Paris this past December. And that has been a remarkable outcome. One of the goals that was set was that the temperature of the world should not rise by more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, over pre-industrial levels. We are halfway there, by the way, right now. That's been the rise we have so far. There's a stretch goal that says, well, let's not go over 1.5 degrees because otherwise small island nations will all disappear. That's going to be harder. That's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The treaty has in place a whole process to move forward, and there were commitments made by almost all of the 195 countries that were in Paris. It's a remarkable achievement. There is no other treaty in the world that has been agreed to by all the parties there, and basically all the members of the United Nations, and blessed by the Pope himself, right? You may recall the Pope came to the U.S. in September last year, spoke to the U.S. Congress, and was so forceful that the next day the Speaker of the House resigned. Well, I won't put any spin on that. I have no idea why he did that. He also spoke to the United Nations, and I can tell you from the negotiators that I've spoken to that his framing this as a moral and ethical issue of harming the poor the most really had an impact and a motivation for many of the negotiators in the countries. So this is a diplomatic triumph, but it comes up way short, as you'll hear. And yet we have in place a process to do something about that. And we have a team here to help you go through that process. First, you'll hear from Dr. Dan Reifsnyder, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Environment. He has had that position for over 10 years. He's been in the State Department since the late 1980s and has been leading the U.S. negotiating team on climate, on ozone depletion issues, he's the one who secured the Mercury Treaty a few years back. And this is tricky stuff for the United States because we have so much division at home as to how we'll proceed. The fact that Dan has served in his position in both Republican and Democratic administrations suggests how much he's respected in terms of his capacities. He was the co-chair of the whole process during 2015 that put together the text that could be negotiated in Paris. And he'll tell us something about how that happened. He'll be followed by Francis Beinecke, who is the former head of the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is really among the very top of the environmental organizations, and they've worked on oceans, they've worked on land protection, and they've been a leading voice for civil society on the climate issue. She was on President Obama's BP spill task force. She is on the Department of Energy advisory group. She advises MIT on their energy plan. She is highly sought out. I actually had the privilege of being grilled along with her by Senator Inhofe of Oklahoma, who is the supreme climate doubter in the United States Senate, and we both took the attack, stood up bravely, and marched out with our heads held high, but a little humiliated. She in turn will be followed by Senator Chris Murphy, who is class of '96, who's here celebrating his reunion. Chris is the junior senator from Connecticut. He was elected in 2012, I believe. And before that, he served several terms as a congressman, and before that, he was in the state legislature. And he will talk to us about what are the prospects in terms of the Congress and Washington in general as to how the U.S. will meet its commitments and the, I suppose, some difficulties, but also the opportunities. And finally, we're very pleased to have with us Elizabeth Kolbert, who is with me, a fellow resident of Williamstown, and a Pulitzer Prize winner last year for her wonderful book, wonderful. It was a depressingly wonderful book. It's called The Sixth Extinction, about the amazing loss of species that we're envisioning. I first got to know her work when she published her book on the field notes from a catastrophe, where she actually went up into the Arctic and reported back exactly what was going on. And as someone who is a climate scientist who works on the policy of this, I found that to be a remarkably accurate and insightful accounting of what goes on. For those of us who are scientists, she is the science writer to whom we turn. She really has an amazing way of getting at the facts, laying them out, and doing it in a way that's readable to every Williams English major. So that's what we have in store for you. And so I'm going to turn now to Dan Reifsnyder to talk about how we got to the outcome in Paris. Dan.
Thanks, Bill. Well, I feel very honored to be here today. I was Bill's PhD student, which is what he didn't tell you, and I just got it a couple years ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. I think education is wasted on the young, so there we are. I was as Bill said, I was the U.S. co-chair of the negotiating process from February of last year until December of last year. I was one of, as we said, there were co-chairs of this process that had begun really in Durban in 2011. We had 3 different sets of co-chairs along the way. It might tell you something about the fact that we didn't have a single chair, which is how most of these things run. We had co-chairs, one from the north, one from the south. We didn't have a single pair of co-chairs. We had 3 separate pairs. That's a measure of the trust people had in the process, you know, that. So as my co-chair, his name was Ahmed Jogloff. He's an ambassador from Algeria, someone I've known since the, well, actually the late 80s, when I met him in New York when he was working on the Second Committee at the UN. But we were quite an unusual, quite an unlikely pair. We actually got along famously, but as Ahmed said, it's sort of like being on an airplane where one set of people, you know, are at the command when you take off. Another set is sort of brought in halfway through, and then they bring in the last pair to land the plane at Le Bourget in Paris in December, which was our job. So it was really quite an amazing event. What we had to do at our very first meeting was to put together a text, because there had been no text up to that point. We managed to do this in about 3 days, which everyone took to be remarkable. But the 96-page text we ended up with was really not a negotiating text, although we called it that. It was a compilation of the views of every single party, and there are 196 parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what we had was kind of, I guess I can use that phrase now because I'm out of the job, so I can call it a hot mess, frankly. And how we got from that through 5 more negotiating sessions between February of 2015 and December was really what Ahmed and I were there to try to do. It was quite an interesting experience. We ended up with about 6 weeks of negotiations, and our job was to end up in Paris with not the final version of the text, because that would be handed off to the French presidency in the final week. And it would be their job to take whatever we gave them and try to come up with a final agreement that could be endorsed and accepted by all of the parties to the convention. But what we had to do is produce something that they could work with, in which you could look at this text and you could find the elements that were going to be part of the final deal. They all had to be there. But how it looked and so forth was the question. We had, in effect, we had both a text of an agreement, a treaty, and we had a decision, a very long decision, that had many of the pieces that would implement the various, almost like a law and regulations. The regulations implement the law that is enacted. That was the difference between them. So we also had to do this at a certain time, and this was a matter of some debate last year as to when the handoff would occur between us running this process. And when I say the process, my wife Catherine, who's here today, hello, said I should describe it because it most often took place among about, a normal negotiation session was about 3,000 to 4,000 delegates. So, you know, if there are 500 in this room, you can kind of figure out the size of the thing we were dealing with. Paris itself was well over 40,000 people. So it was really, you couldn't really see us from back there. We were up on big television screens at the front of the room most of the time. So just try to appreciate the kind of cavernous, Ahmed called the room in which we negotiated in Paris a cathedral. When he walked in, he said, "This is a cathedral," looking at it. But we were able to bring this text to a point where we could hand it to the French presidency, to Laurent Fabius, who was then the foreign minister of France, on Saturday of the last week, in a shape that then the French, with their consummate diplomatic skills, and it really took a lot, but they moved it. If you liken this, say, to an ascent of Mount Everest, we took it from the base camp to South Col, and the French took it from South Col to the summit, was really what happened. But that transition also had to occur very carefully, because I was telling Bill earlier, the ADP, this ad hoc negotiating group on the Durban platform, as the group was known that I co-chaired, it was known, I used to finally say to people, this is the people's body. Whatever crazy thing we do in the ADP has all the legitimacy in the world. And anything done outside of the ADP begins to lack legitimacy. And so the issue was, how do you move from this negotiation in the ADP with something intelligible to the French and end the ADP, stop it, and have the French take over in a process at a higher level with ministers from and leaders, representatives from all the 196 countries, and get to the final deal. That was really what we were doing. And it was, I said to people, I've had young people come in and say to me, you know, I really don't care, you know, where a decision is made as long as the right decision is made. And having been in the government now for 41 some years, I love to say to them, you know, my young friend, if you don't care where a decision is made, you will never get the right decision. I really truly believe that, you know, good process doesn't guarantee a good substantive outcome, but bad process will virtually eclipse any hope of it. And I think that's what Ahmed in particular, Ahmed and I were able to deliver last year. Good process, a text that the French could work with, and a handoff at the right time frame so that the entire process had the legitimacy it needed for 196 countries to agree unanimously to adopt it. So I'll end there.
So I'm going to just give a little bit of flavor from the environmental community in this process and where we go from here. I just want to say, putting it in the context of looking to the future and why this is such an important issue. David Tunick and I share a grandchild. His daughter, his son, my daughter, have a little girl, Lumen. And Lumen will be here in 2100. And when we start talking about the changes that this planet will see in sea level rise, in temperature, in extreme weather events, these suddenly are not abstract predictions of the future. These are things that we will see in our lifetime, our children will see, and our grandchildren will experience in the most severe way. And the urgency of climate change, I mean, we're talking about the agreement and the science. There is such a deep urgency to how this issue is going to change the fabric of this planet that we live on, that everyone in this room needs to think through how it will affect you, your family, and what you can do to change the direction they were going in. Bill, the scientific community, Dan, the diplomatic community, have been working long and hard to explain worldwide why this is such a critical issue and why we need to act on it. It was amazing in Paris. I was there. Not only did the diplomats do an incredible job, but there were thousands of people who came from around the world. The voice of youth, which is certainly represented at Williams College. I'm sure there were many undergraduates from Williams who were there. People from all over the world, people from low-lying nations whose future is at risk. And when Bill mentioned that in Paris, they adopted this aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees, that was a huge sea change. I mean, I'm curious if Dan knows of any international negotiation that you could go into where you would come out with a stronger goal than what you went in. And the reason that occurred was because of the outpouring of civil society. It wasn't because of the diplomats. They could never have agreed. It was because the people who were on the front lines facing climate change each and every day basically were in their face and saying, our future is at risk. Our land will be gone if you do not act. And they acted. I thought it was phenomenal. It was one of the most heartening things, really, I have experienced. But now, Paris is the beginning, not the end. Now the hard work begins. We all acknowledge it's not enough. We all acknowledge that much more is required. We need to accelerate the shift to clean energy away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. There are companies, businesses, governments at every level, cities, states, federal, all over the world who are taking action, who are trying to figure out what the path is forward. One of the key elements is, where is the money going to come from? Is there enough money? There's not enough yet. We have to unlock investment. We need policies. Senator Murphy's going to talk about that. What are the policies that we can put in place? But none of that will happen if there isn't a demand from people, if the voice of people is not raised to really insist that our politicians and our leaders take the steps necessary to get us on a clean energy pathway, to ensure that we manage our natural resources, our forests and our soils, and our oceans in a way that they are resilient, that they can provide sequestration of carbon, that they can be maintained to provide the things that we depend on, air, water, food, for future generations. I like to say, a lot of people think that climate change is an environmental problem. It is not an environmental problem. This is a global problem of the greatest scope. The environmental community has a role, and we will play it, which is to be an ongoing advocate, to work as hard as we can, to shift as fast as we can away from fossil fuels. That means stopping the bad stuff, including the Keystone Pipeline, new coal leases, oil and gas leasing offshore in the Arctic and the Atlantic. These are all current issues. For those of you who are members of organizations, you're hearing about it all the time. Decisions are made each and every day that can head us in the right direction or the wrong direction. And we need to hold our leaders accountable to make sure that we go in the right direction. And let me tell you, this is really hard work. This has been so much harder and is taking so much longer than we ever anticipated, those of us who've been working on it for decades. And the community that I think is most alarmed is the scientific community, because the scientific community are the people who are actually looking at the facts on the ground. They are looking at what the data is showing them about how quickly these changes are occurring. And the reality is they're changing much faster than were originally anticipated. And I think we made mistakes as a result of that by saying this is a problem of future generations, because I think we thought it was in the 90s. But guess what? It's not. It's now. And so we have to shift away from the way we've been talking about these issues to shift to a sense of urgency, immediacy, an issue that really all sectors, from the faith community, from government, corporations, citizens groups, really need to figure out what role can I can play, how can I participate in this? And everybody can participate in this. This is an issue of, I think, ethical responsibility for all of us, and there are lots of ways to do it in our own, the way we live our lives, the way we hold our leaders accountable, the votes we make when we have those opportunities as citizens in a democracy. This is an issue that will have such grave implications on the fate of everybody we know and love that, I really encourage all of you to learn more about it, to find those strategies that will allow you to be engaged. The environmental community is only one piece of this, and we can't do it alone. And as I say, it's not an environmental issue. It's a societal issue. You don't have to come at it through an environmental lens. You don't have to be a member of an environmental group. You can just be a citizen who cares about the fate of the world, which I'm sure you all do. So I urge you to engage and be involved, and thank you so much for your interest. And now I'm going to turn it over to the senator, because clearly, in the end, there's so many policies we need to actually get us down that clean energy pathway, and we depend so much on our elected leaders to get us there. Thank you.
So I've been asked to cover here the ways in which Congress can help us meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Elizabeth for her portion of the program. Thank you very much for having me and letting me take a short break from chasing around a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old around campus. I think I've been asked to cover two big subjects here, which is the policy and a little bit of the politics. And so I'll try to do both very, very quickly, but I'm so glad to have been asked to be a part of this. First on the policy. We start with a lot of good news, which is that if you look at the United States' commitment in Paris, we are the majority of the way there already, right? If you count together what we have done with respect to the new vehicle emission standards that were put into effect at the very beginning of the Obama administration, making cars about 40% more fuel efficient, less emissions than prior versions. If you take the new clean power plant rule, which is going to go into effect. Right now, there's legal questions around the timing of its implementation, but there is no question that the Supreme Court has ruled that the EPA has the power to regulate greenhouse gases. And maybe most importantly, because it's actually something that was passed by Congress, Republicans and Democrats, the new tax incentives that give some real certainty for the build-out of renewable energy sources like wind and solar. Our friends at the State Department might tell you that that gets us 75% of the way there. Folks who are maybe a little bit more skeptical might tell you that gets you somewhere in the high 60% of the way there, but it's certainly more than half. So we start understanding that we've made some really significant progress already. Now, 2/3 of what I just laid out there for you are political in nature, in that vehicle emission standards or the Clean Power Plant rule, there can be a different disposition in a different administration, but they are baked into our current policy. And so the question is, how do we get the rest of the way there? And I'm sincere in my overwhelming skepticism that the United States Congress is going to pass any major legislation combating climate change in the near future. You have right now the majority of the Congress being occupied by individuals who deny that the phenomenon is real. And frankly, you're looking at a Congress that even when 90% of us agree on something, still can't actually get it to the finish line. So forget it if you have more than 50% who can't even agree on the problem, never mind the solution. There are some things that can get done. So we did pass this major tax bill that provides real incentives for renewable energy. And how did we do that? Well, we essentially made a trade. We essentially took Republicans who wanted the ability to export oil out of this country, and we said, we'll give you the ability to do that if you give us long-term certainty on tax incentives for renewable energy, and you give us some real good, stable funding for land conservation and land preservation. Now, there's a climate cost to exporting oil, but you balance it all out, and it's a pretty positive equation. The question is, will there be more opportunities to make compromises, to make trades that have net positive climate benefits down the line? The answer to that question is probably yes. There are some pieces of the climate agenda that are a little bit less politically volatile than regulation of carbon dioxide. The only climate change bill that's bipartisan that's in the Senate right now is myself and Susan Collins from Maine, who have a bill that tries to attack HFCs and methane and black carbon, which tend to just have a little bit less political controversy around it than carbon dioxide might. And then there's certainly still more administrative actions that the next administration could take. So nothing as big as the Clean Power Plant rule, but there are certainly things on, for instance, green building standards that the next administration could move on that could help close that 25-30% gap. But as we'll talk about, there are also these tremendous market dynamics that are already at play that are going to exist regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats are in charge of the Congress. Right? The coal industry has lost 90% of their market value in the last 10 years. Right? 90% of the market value has been lost amongst coal companies. That trend line is continuing no matter what we do. On the politics, there are two questions. Republicans ask, why have Democrats been totally and completely duped by scientists, right? And Democrats ask, right? Why don't Republicans agree with the 99 point whatever % of scientists who agree that this is a phenomenon worth tackling? Now, clearly, I can only answer one of those questions standing here today as someone who believes that we should act. And I just offer two prescriptions. It is undoubtedly hard for sort of young, up-and-coming Republicans to disassociate themselves with the climate change denial movement when the fossil fuel industry funds almost all of the think tanks that you go to try to sort of piece together your belief system when you are becoming a Republican activist. That is just the truth of how a lot of conservative think tanks are funded at the state level, at the local level, and at the national level. So there is unfortunately just a special interest story here, which I think you can't deny. But second, even amongst Republicans who aren't 100% climate skeptics or deniers, there is today just a white-hot intensity in their fear of government, that government can do anything that is useful, that leads them to suggest that in the end, the market will just take care of this problem too. That yes, there's probably an issue here, but somehow the market will come up with the developments and the technologies that will figure this out. And you can even see today that corporations are already starting to get serious about it and move under their own volition. So the government, will just screw this up like they screw everything else up, so we should stay out of it. And so those two phenomenons, both the sort of message and the ideology and the issue base of the party being controlled by fossil fuel companies, and then this just distaste for any government intervention, even in trying to rearrange markets, is, I think, how you get to a place in which you have just two parties living on different planets when it comes to this issue. But again, I come back to sort of the positivity of my initial comments. If we're already 3/4 of the way there, then it's actually not impossible to get the rest of the way. There are those places where we can agree. There are trades we can make that accrue to the benefit of Paris. And then there are market dynamics that are already in place because of policy and because of international work that can get us the rest of the way there. So I certainly am skeptical about our ability to do big things, but I am not skeptical of our ability to ultimately meet our obligations under Paris. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to correct us on everything we got wrong. So.
Well, I wanted to, as a reporter, it's actually extremely rare. I don't know how, if people in the audience realize how fortunate they are to have a panel like this, a group where one person was in the room all the way up to Paris, and one person is in the room at the U.S. Senate. So I wanted to use a couple minutes just to ask some questions, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions. But before I ask that question, I want to give a little bit of background because I know that everyone up here is very steeped in climate politics. And the prelude to my question begins with Kyoto and what an outlier the U.S. has always been. The Kyoto Protocol was actually eventually, which was an addendum to the Framework Convention. We won't go through all of these terrible acronyms and things like that. But it was a treaty that the U.S. was one of the few industrialized countries to never sign on to and never meet its obligations under. So the U.S. came into this latest round of negotiations, which everyone has been lauding as a success, and I will not detract from that, as a tremendous pariah, basically, I would say. And it was up to people like Dan to try to convince the world that we were not, that, okay, this time we're really going to get serious, we're going to actually do something. And the step that happened in between there was a deal between the US and China that was very important. And then these series of regulations, two major regulations that Senator Murphy alluded to, the auto regulations, mileage regulations, and the Clean Power Plan. Okay, so that brings us to today. That shows that the U.S. was supposedly serious about meeting a new commitment under Paris, although even so, the U.S. presented its commitment in ways that no other country did. For example, the U.S.'s commitment only goes through 2025. It was supposed to go through 2030. I'd be very interested to hear how that went over. But here's my basic question. We are now at a point where the Clean Power Plan, that is the centerpiece of the U.S.'s contribution to Paris, is under serious legal attack. It was supposed to be heard in June, the case by the appeals court. It's been now moved to September. if we did not have a vacancy on the Supreme Court and we were taking these regulations to the Supreme Court, I think there's a very widespread belief that they would have been knocked down in the Supreme Court. So we're in this very weird situation where the main the main pillar of the U.S.'s commitment is under legal attack, and we don't know how it's going to come out. And I wanted to pose to members of the panel, and maybe I'll ask Dan first, since he was in the room in Paris, what you think the significance of that is and how you think all that's going to play out.
Well, okay. It's very interesting because I was teaching a class, actually, at a course at University of Virginia this winter. I called it Climate Politics. And between one class on Monday night and the next class the following Monday night, we had the Supreme Court stay the power plant rule, and we had Justice Scalia die. So it was real life, I mean, for this group of students, and for me as well. Your question was, how is this playing out internationally? I think there's concern on the part of our partners about what will happen. But I also think that it was always anticipated there would be litigation over the Clean Power Plant rule. And I think that EPA moved very carefully and very deliberately to craft a rule that will stand up in court. So I think the very strong feeling on the part of the administration is this rule will pass the test of, whatever test is thrown at it legally. So I don't think, and that's been the message to others as well, yes, this is a challenge. It was not unanticipated. We think it's going to survive. And moreover, EPA has said we're willing to work with any state now that wants to work with us. So we're open for business. It simply means that EPA cannot order states to begin developing these rules, but many of them are doing so of their own volition, and EPA is willing to work with them today.
Also address that. I think, so there's been tremendous, I guess both sides on the equation of the Supreme Court case have done a lot of legal analysis, and the Supreme Court has 3 prior decisions upheld the authority of EPA to regulate carbon. So even if the Supreme Court, and we actually think the Clean Power Plan will be upheld, but if they made a decision which slowed it down, modified the way the analysis was done in setting the targets for the state. The way it works is each of the 48 states, I believe it is, have a target of what their emission reduction has to be based on what their current energy mix is. And so the formulas that are used are very much under analysis. So, there may be a decision that, as there was in the mercury air toxics rule, asking EPA to go back and redo it somehow, but I think it's extremely unlikely that they would throw it out. So there hasn't been, I think, a major air quality regulation coming out of the Clean Air Act that hasn't gone through litigation, that hasn't been slowed down, but I think the United States is on a pathway using the Clean Air Act to regulate carbon. It may be modified somewhat, but I believe it will continue to prevail as the dominant. And the other thing that's happening in the United States is there is tremendous unleashing of clean energy, renewable energy, and very fundamental to that are the tax credits that have been renewed. Actually, Senator Murphy may want to talk about that. And a lot of people think that they will actually have more impact on unlocking the markets, moving us to clean energy even faster than the Clean Power Plant will. So there's a very bright side, which is the unleashing of renewables, as well as, I think, a certain amount of confidence that the Clean Power Plant will survive this.
I would just add, Paris is a political document. It is not a treaty in the sense that none of the country's commitments are binding. So any country could theoretically walk away from those commitments. But even if it was a treaty, frankly, there are, plenty of examples of countries deciding with administration change that they're going to walk away from treaty obligations anyway. In the United States, although our commitment, it would be lovely if it was longer than 2025, it's to 2025, our commitment is really only to December of this year. Let's be honest. Our commitment is only to December of this year. So I don't know that Donald Trump would walk back the auto emission standards because those are so sort of far down the road. But it's clear that he would take the opportunity to rethink or repeal the Clean Power Plant decision. I mean, that certainly is on the ballot. So these are political documents, and our obligation is certainly only as good as an administration's decision to stand by it.
Elizabeth, if I could just mention, you threw out the challenge about 2025, 2030, just to say that the United States was one of a number of countries that supported 2025 instead of 2030, precisely because we didn't want to lock in low ambition to 2030. We know that today we could only commit to things up to 2025 that would really be robust. We didn't want to just play that out and end up with a mediocre target for 2030. So that was really the reason. It was more because we were anxious to see more ambition than less.
Maybe I should. Okay, I'm gonna take the whatever. I'm gonna throw it open to questions from you all. I don't know if there's a mic out there. Is there a mic out there? Usually not. Okay. So you'll just have to yell. Okay, I'll let Bill do that.
All right. Yes.
First of all, Bill, I shared misbehaviors at my campus with you in the 1960s, Steve Clary, class of 62. I'm also a 100% solar power in California, and I also drive an electric car with a 200-mile range. So with those bona fides established, let me ask the question to you, perhaps, and to your panel, on a broader scale, that I think maybe it's the UN has established a 3,000 kilowatt hour minimum standard for living above the poverty line around the world. And today, about 2 billion people are failing to achieve that level. By 2050, we'll have a population increase of, let's be conservative and say from 7 to 9 billion. The numbers of people living below that 3,000 kilowatt hour will grow, not diminish. And so what sort of a global policy approach would you have to solve the climate issue at the same time we have the social justice issue of bringing people above the minimal kilowatt hours for a lifestyle?
Okay, next question, please. That's a very profound question, Steve. It really is. It's clear people cannot get to a better place. Certainly the poorest 2 or 3 billion on the planet cannot get to a better place unless they use more energy than they're using now. One of the bright spots is we're discovering we can use less energy than we would otherwise. I mean, my house uses only 6,000 kilowatt hours a year to do everything. And most people use that just for their lights and their appliances. So and we heat here in Williamstown and everything else. So we're learning how to do it better, and we're learning how to do it with less impact on the environment. And I don't want to be too much of a technological optimist, but I don't want to be a pessimist either. I think the technology is advancing really rapidly, and the piece that did not get much attention in Paris is that something like 55 multinational corporations promised to be 100% renewable within the next few years. 44 regions, provinces, states, California and others had major commitments. If you add up all those, it was about the same as what the US and the EU were committing to. So there are ways in which this is happening outside of this legal document. Right? And I think that's great. I mean, I think it will. When it happens, when people are doing it, and they're doing it because it gives them the services they want. They don't want energy, they want energy services, right? They want they want lights, they want, all these things. So figuring out how to do that, and this is where I think the market has a huge role to play, and innovation has a huge role to play. So I don't think we're going to force it all through legislation or treaties or anything else, but that sets the goals. I believe that treaties are really aspirational and inspirational primarily, and they help focus us. This is the direction the world has decided to go. Let's all get aboard and move in that direction. There's a question up here. Yes.
Okay. I'm Steve. I'm from Alberta, Canada. Probably perceived by some of you as the devil. My question is this, Keystone Pipeline. I want to understand the opposition to the Keystone Pipeline. The United States brings in a lot of oil from Venezuela, countries like Saudi Arabia. Some of these countries are not very friendly. Why would you, I assume, prefer to bring in oil from these kinds of countries as opposed to having oil come in from Canada on the Keystone Pipeline?
The question was the Keystone Pipeline, which would brought oil from the oil sands region of Alberta. Well, yes, but particularly from that area. And the opposition was to the dirtiest oil on earth, really, was kind of the attitude. And the amount of deforestation that has taken place, and despite the promises that, don't worry, someday we will restore all this, which will never happen. I mean, it's an asphalt parking lot in places, really was problematic for people. And to lock ourselves into 50 more years of really dirty oil, I'm speaking Bill McKibben's line here, would be a huge mistake. What we need to be doing is phasing out those things. It's the same in the Arctic. Why should we go drill in the Arctic when we have more than enough oil now to exceed the 2-degree or the 1.5-degree goal in Paris? So there's a real sense that we should stop taking in new things, particularly the ones that are more energy intensive, more carbon intensive, and that was the real rationale. So we've actually cut way back. We don't import much oil from Venezuela anymore. That's also really heavy, dirty oil. And we've reduced our oil consumption. Our oil consumption in the United States peaked in 2005. So we've been down for 11 years. We're down for 11 years now, and we're headed downward further. So why bring on these new sources? I think that was the rationale that was in the United States.
Follow-up question. What are the guarantees that oil coming from overseas is in any clean?
Well, see, the other thing is we've become so successful at fracking, we don't need that oil, right? I think that's the other attitude. Next question. Yes. Yes.
The most recent discussion between China and America. You said there was a recent discussion between China and America. What were the relative points of that?
Who would like to answer that?
Well, I could maybe start, but I think
the question was what were the discussions between the U.S. and China about climate change?
I can just tell you that part of what I did during my PhD research, I know that isn't answering your question exactly, but it plays in, just trust me. I would talk to negotiators from the different countries, and I said, it was about leadership and about U.S. leadership, and I said, what role does the U.S. play? How important is what the U.S. does, and so forth? And to a person, everybody I talked to said, the United States and China, China and the United States, it all depends on what you guys, the two of you, do, because collectively you are over 40% of global emissions, these two countries. And so I think the United States, the administration certainly recognized that a successful outcome in Paris was going to depend first and foremost on what the two biggest emitters were going to do, and on being able to put their commitments down, or we call them contributions down, early for all the world to see. And so there was an effort made. When Secretary Kerry came in to the State Department, one of the very first things he did was to start something called the U.S.-China Climate Change Working Group. And that working group led to very intense work on a number of areas, specific hands-on efforts to reduce emissions and so forth between the two countries. But more importantly, it led to this policy dialogue where in November of 2014, a full year before Paris, we were able to stand with the Chinese and each announced to the world what we would do. The Chinese announced what their goals were going to be, and the United States announced what its goals were going to be. And this didn't happen. They weren't negotiated. They weren't agreed by each side, but we were able to share information and share the methodology and feel comfortable standing together and saying to the world at the same time, here's what the two largest emitters would do. That was huge in Lima, which was the conference of the parties immediately before Paris. It really put wind in the sails and gave this thing a great chance of success. So that was really the significance of the U.S.-China announcement, but it was major, I would say.
Yes.
I have a question back to the is climate change an environmental issue? And when we experienced Tropical Storm Irene and New York experienced Sandy, the communities that were most heavily affected and still are affected are low-income communities. Our mobile home parks were disproportionately damaged. So I'm curious, Senator, if you're hearing from low-income advocates, from housing advocates, from from the labor community, are you hearing from advocates outside of the environmental and energy geek world to push this issue, because it is so fundamentally hitting lower income Americans?
Yeah, not enough. I mean, so yes. I mean, the answer to that question is yes. And I represent, all of the Connecticut coastal community that was devastated by Sandy, and you still have people who are out of their homes because some of those complexes were damaged to the point that no one could ever return. They were in pretty bad shape to begin with, by the way, because we haven't built new affordable housing in this country in about 50 years. And so when they got shocked by this storm, that was the end for some of these facilities. So yes, I think there is a level of awareness and activism amongst activists on this issue, but it's frankly not big enough. And listen, I think that's our challenge. Our challenge here is to find all of the different ways in which to articulate this message. And we haven't touched today on the national security implications of ignoring climate change. I sit on the Foreign Relations Committee as well, and you just have to scratch the Syrian crisis, with about 2 fingernails in order to figure out that what precipitated that unrest was a record drought that drove millions of Syrians out of the rural areas into the cities with no ability to figure out how to feed and clothe and educate all of those people, which then 3 steps later led to the unrest that we see today. And you can tell that same story in Mali and many other places. And so I think this is a bigger challenge in which we've got to make people understand that this is a national security crisis, this is a housing crisis, this is a justice crisis, this is also an environmental crisis.
Right. And I might just add that the Defense Department every 4 years has the Quadrennial Defense Review. And in that, there's an awful lot of this most recent one about climate change and how it will generate and is generating the very unrest that we're seeing and the migrant crisis. It was predicted in there, 2 or 3 years ago when that came out, that this would happen. And so the military is very aware of this problem. Next, yes.
I'd like the panel's opinion on if we meet the carbon, the caps from Paris, will we actually achieve 2%? There's optimism coming from the panel about sort of meeting these, but what I've read from scientists is that actually the level set in Paris will not get us to 2%.
To 2 degrees, 2 degrees, yes. That's absolutely true. It will not. Without Paris, we would go, instead of being at 2 degrees, we'd be at 4.5 degrees, which is about 8.7 degrees Fahrenheit. With Paris, we'll be not at 4.5, but at 3.5. So we have a ways to go. But the good news in Paris is that there's a process for doing that. This is not the be-all and end-all. Every few years, we're supposed to re-examine, and they call it ratchet up. Just everybody make stronger commitments. Because it's pretty obvious, what we have now will not get us there. But before this, we had nothing. We didn't have a process. We had absolutely nothing. That's why I call it a diplomatic success, which doesn't quite meet the goal, right? But it does help us. It does give us a way to meet the goal.
If I could add to that, Paris, as I said, it's really a beginning. The fact that the nations agreed was huge, earth-shaking. I mean, it was dramatic. It's never happened before. Everyone knows it's not enough, but hopefully the commitments that are on the table and this commitment to review within 5 years and raise ambitions will actually start getting the money flowing and the investments and the changes in technology, and that the acceleration will actually happen at a faster pace. And that also, again, is where civil society comes in, because there has to be an enormous effort to drive this, to drive each of the countries to raise their ambitions, to realize the goals, to hold these corporations accountable for the commitments they made. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of work to achieve where we need to go, but we're starting down that path. And I think for people who've worked in this for so long, the fact that there's agreement to start down the path and there's so much energy going into it is hugely significant. It's hard, I think, sometimes to see in the United States because this is such a divisive issue. If you go anywhere else in the world, they wonder why that is the case. Because, for example, I was in Southeast Asia earlier this year where the monsoon is changing in India and Southeast Asia. In India, they had temperatures that peaked at 123 degrees Fahrenheit a couple of weeks ago. I mean, these have huge human consequences to very large populations. There's no question that it's changing. It's like, what are we going to do about it? How do we adapt? How do we create resilience? How do we get technologies out there? So, you know, Paris is absolutely at a hugely important step towards a very long-term commitment that is very deep and needs widespread engagement.
I think I got the sign, we have time for one more question. Let me see, up here in the back. Yes?
So if you were to envision a world in 30 years in which we have actually taken the steps to meet the demands of climate change that we need to, what do you see society as looking like? What does the world look like if we can meet these challenges? Like, what are our homes like? What are our communities like? What is the country like?
All right, what will the world look like in 30 years if we actually get on track and start doing this? Elizabeth, what would you say? It'd be like, all right.
I like
One
the
answer
way
was the new
give it to
environmental center.
Yeah, a journalist. I think the world would have to look very, you know, I'm giving my very, you know, on the basis of talking to a lot of people over a long time, to meet the Paris goals and even certainly to meet a 2-degree goal, to be on a path to that in 30 years, because we will have exceeded 2 degrees in 30 years at our current rate. And a point that I'd just like to make as a scientific point is emissions are cumulative. So we are talking basically about permanence. When you put CO2 up there, it stays there for a very long tail. People have talked about the long tail of climate change, and it lasts 100,000 years. Okay, so we're not talking about temporary blips. We're talking about permanent changes. We have a very short window, and our world would need to look radically different, I believe. We would all be needing not only to do more with less, but we'd be needing to do less with less, I believe. We are not going to be able to continue to do everything that we do and meet that 2-degree goal. And that is a very difficult message. And I think I don't want to be the one delivering it, but it's true. I believe that it is true.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I'd just like to add one thing. Betsy's right. You know, if we put this in, it stays for a very long time, hundreds, if not thousands of years. It doesn't go away. Fortunately, right now, we've had in place a technology that's been working for about 300 million years. It's solar-powered. It's called plants and soils. And they suck up carbon dioxide. We need to enhance that. It's already taking about an amount equal to 1/4 of what we emit every single year is going into forests and soils. Unfortunately, we're destroying those every year rather than having them sustain us every year. But we know how to do that. And so we really have to make sure that we don't do foolish things with the biosphere, with the living part of this planet. And if we do that and combine it, if we go to zero with all our technology and energy, we still have to start drawing it out, and we have to build that capacity. If we do both, I'm quite optimistic. So let's all get out there and see what we can do. Thank you all very much for being here.